What's going on, everybody? It's Charles. In this video, we're going to be rebuilding and upgrading a 1.8 turbo engine for this Audi TT. The 1.8 turbo that we are rebuilding today is an engine used in a ton of VWs and Audis from the mid-2000s. The engine is out of a 180 Audi TT with the engine code AWP. In addition to the rebuild, we're also going to be making several upgrades along the way, including forged rods and overboard forged pistons. This engine was actually in the Jetta, the GTI, the Beetle, the Passat, the A4, the A3, and of course the TTs, and the rebuild process for these is pretty much the same no matter what. I've also done a separate in-depth video on how to time this engine both on the chain side and on the belt side that I'll be sure to link up. Now, since everything's been measured, these caps are actually torqued down, so we're gonna remove the caps, we're gonna remove the bearings, and then do a little bit better cleaning on the block. Odds are it's gonna be fine, but I just feel a little bit better doing an extra step cleaning. We would have to take these caps off anyway to put the crankshaft in, so we're really not doing any extra work. So we'll go ahead and get the caps, the bolts, and the bearings out, and we're gonna keep these all lined up in order since we've already made our measurements. Now for the third one, we also need our thrust washer to be installed. We'll make sure we get that set up too. Now overall our block is in pretty good shape, but like all this old sealant and where the water pump goes and where the thermostat goes, we want to get all that as cleaned out as we can now. If we do it now, we can just take some compressed air and blow all this yuck out, not have to worry about getting yuck in a place where we don't want any yuck. Our first order of business is going to be getting our piston squirters in. Now I actually have two sets here because, well, that's how many we have. What these do is these mount in the block and they actually squirt oil up underneath the piston. Now you'll notice there's holes all around here, right there. But in the other end, where the thing is threaded, there's this little silver piece. This is actually a ball, and there's a spring inside the body here. Now I have one that's bad. You can actually see that ball just moving around in there when I poke it with a toothpick. This is bad. We don't want to put this one in. What you do want to do is you want to check each one of these things and make sure that when you push the ball down, it comes back to its seated position. So this one here, this one is good. Let me show you that bad one again. This guy here, you can see how it's recessed. This is bad. So the spring is bad or broken or something. So we definitely don't want to put this one in. The way you want to clean these, just spray some brake parts cleaner in the holes and then give that ball a push. Make sure there's no yuck stuck in it or that it's clogged or like carboned up. It does need to move a little bit. Also, in addition to cleaning out the inside, you want to make sure the threads are cleaned as well. We will take this little guy, be careful. You can see it squirtling out of the bottom there. And just flush it out. You can also take the little red straw. Yeah, that was more than I expected. So if you just push down on that a little bit with the red straw, you saw a little bit of junk come out of there. Now that we got our little squirty guys all cleaned up, let's go ahead and install them. Fun fact, these have an opening pressure of about 20 PSI. So if you want to officially test them that way, you can do that. Once we get the piston installed, we'll have to make sure that our clearance is good there as well. And we're going to torque these to 27 Newton meters. We'll go ahead and get the rest of our jets installed. These are basically just for piston cooling. You do want to make sure that it's seated all the way and doesn't get all spun sideways on you. I'm gonna go ahead and get them all started and then we'll come back and torque them. Now because we had one that was bad, I gotta use one bolt that's different. Not a big deal, a thing. So we'll go ahead and torque these again, 27 Newton meters. They don't call for replacing these, but if you're in any way like not sure about the integrity of those bolts, go ahead and replace them. And just to satisfy my OCD, we're gonna mark these so we know that they're torqued. Next up, it is time to clean our main journals. Even though this thing has been to the machine shop and all that, look at how much dirt gets left behind. We also sprayed the engine off with compressed air. So it's a good idea, always, always, always to get these nice and clean. Not only the bearing surface, but where the cap goes to is a good idea to wipe down. And if you hadn't already done, clean and blow out these holes for our main bolts. On most Volkswagen Audi engines are one-time use. Unless you're going like ARP or something like that, then you don't have to get new ones, you can reuse those. Just to make sure we don't have any lint left over, I'm gonna blow those journals out. We'll go ahead and drop our bearings back in next. Now, because I've turned the block around, you know what? Let's go ahead and turn the engine back around the other way so that we don't end up screwing it up. All right, now that we're back in action here with our goodies facing the proper direction as we took it off, we can go ahead and keep on keeping on with our bearing installation. Ooh, I got a piece of fuzz. I'm also cleaning these as we go, mostly the back side of them where they go into the block. These babies being clean and dry is important. If you've ever heard someone say, I spun a bearing, what happens is either this bearing or a rod bearing will come unseated and it'll rotate independent from the crankshaft and cause a big old mess. Next up, it's time to get our crankshaft ready to go in. Now, this is the crankshaft out of the block that came with the car. And the reason we used this one was the second block we used, the bearing surface was destroyed, so the crank was basically junk. The third block, the reason they replaced the engine, which didn't need to actually be replaced, which is why we got it, but something dinked the crankshaft and bent the wheel here for the engine speed sensor. So all the measurements and everything were taken off the crankshaft that we got with the car, the original crankshaft from the engine, and all the machine shop did was polish the journals and make sure everything was good. So really, the only thing we need to do is just get this cleaned up, clean our bearing surfaces, and then put it in. See, even though we had it cleaned and everything, still dirty. This is why it may seem like I'm overkill on cleaning stuff, but we're not making microchips, as I often like to say, but if we have the opportunity to clean something now, it's gonna be easier to clean it now than it'll ever be again. Take the extra 5 minutes now and get it done. Then for cleaning the journals, I just like to go like this, clean, 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 wipey wipe, wipey wipe, and we'll blow all the dust and junk off of it right before we install it. We'll go ahead and wipe our bearings down. These should be fine, but next up we'll get our installation paste and pre-lube these guys. This will help on initial startup. Make sure these are nice and coated. Excellent. We can go ahead and set our crankshaft in. Awkwardly balance this here. There we go. The engine stand kind of gets in the way back here, but that's okay. All right. We are in business. Now, we can go ahead and put our mains on. I went ahead and I not only cleaned where the bearing meets the cap, but also right here where the cap is going to meet the block. Then put a little looby lube on there. And by looby lube, I mean Liqui-Moly LM48 installation paste. I'm actually going to do this one next. Main number 3 is the one that has the thrust washers in it that control how much movement back and forth the crankshaft has. I actually got new ones. This is a place where really, if the crankshaft's not damaged in any way, usually these are just fine on this particular engine, but this is one of those things that it's not going to be easy to reinstall after the engine's all together. So I think they were like 30 bucks for new ones. So I'm going to go ahead and put some new ones in rather than reusing the old ones. The old ones actually look okay. There's a couple of spots. You wouldn't say, oh, this engine has a problem based on this, basically. You know you'll have the correct main cap with the thrust bearing, and then the bearing sits in the channel like that and pokes down through to the lower cap. Now, for this cap, it's all clean and everything. Not only am I going to put some engine lubrication and installation paste here, I'm going to put a little bit right here. All that's really going to do for me is hold our thrust washer in place while we get it installed. Now, it won't just fall out when I hold it up like this. And I usually like to do this one either first or first and second so that you have a little bit of crankshaft movement just in case you need it. That's all the way down in there. So just like that, nice and easy. I'll just go ahead and do the rest of them exactly the same. Then we'll go ahead and torque those down. I usually start the bolts by hand. Then what I'll do is I'll take an end of a rubber mallet and just give them a tap. Make sure the caps are seated all the way. Basically, you just don't want to use the bolts to run them down. If you do that, you can get them kind of wonky, and then you might not actually torque the bolts down properly. Now it is time to tighten our main cap bolts down. First, we're going to snug them. Then we're going to go ahead and start tightening them. The torque spec for these is 65 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. I'm going to tighten them to like 20. Then I'll go up to 65. Then we'll do our 90 degrees. This just does it a little more evenly. Makes me feel a little bit better. May not really be necessary. These are also stretch bolts, hence the plus 90. So make sure that you replace these every time. Or go with something like ARP studs, then you don't have to replace the hardware all the time. And moving the engine stand around. It's one of the bad things about having these small ones. You almost need a friend. Now, before we go to our next step, which is going to be our plus 90, I usually like to spin the crankshaft and make sure it actually spins. You should be able to do this by hand. Oh yeah, ooh, that's real nice. That's real, I don't even need the socket on there. That's real nice. Okay, there we go. Now we can do our plus 90. Now for the plus 90, you can do your angle wrench if you prefer to do it that way. I like to just put a mark, usually around 12 o'clock of the bolt, whichever way you want, because it doesn't really matter. Going back and double checking torque is easy. If it's 65 Newton meters, you just go back and put the torque wrench on it and do another 65 Newton meters. So I put these marks on there, and then what I'll do is I'll go ahead and do our 90. Then at a quick glance, we can go, okay, not only do we tighten them, right, they're torqued, which is these marks, they're also all lined up. So if you missed one, it clearly stands out. All right, let's see if I can do this without flubbling on the camera. It's also pretty easy to eyeball. 90 degrees, quarter turn, plus 90. So now they're all facing the same way. We're good to go. Also, after you do your quarter turn, go ahead and give your crankshaft a little twisty. There's probably a little bit more resistance than with it not fully torqued, but as you can see, I'm just rolling this around by hand. By the time we get the pistons in, we might not be able to do that. Well, now it is time to do, as y'all know, something that is my favorite thing, and that's deal with our pistons and our piston rings. So one of the main reasons we got this is when dude was putting it together, he actually broke a piston ring. So here are our upgraded pistons. Actually, let me grab an old one so you can see the direct difference head to head. Here's the stock piston. Here's the modified one. Oh man, it's not even close. Also, how about these old school IE piston rods, huh? So this is what came out of, this might actually be one that did come out of the engine proper, and then this is what we're putting into it. Quite a bit of a beefy boy over this thing. They're also 0.5 millimeter difference in diameter. We're gonna have to make sure we do a couple of things. One, we need to check and set our ring end gap, which means we're probably gonna have to file our rings. With these pistons, we got this cool little piece of paper that tells us, hey, based on your application, here's how you calculate ideal piston ring end gap. So you take the measurement of the bore, and the measurement of the bore that we have is 3.2086 inches, or roughly 81.5 millimeters. They list a couple of different applications that you can see. We have high performance street, and then we have street, modified turbo, or nitrous. Even though this is a high performance street, and probably won't ever see the drag strip, we are boosted, which means we need a slightly bigger ring end gap. So I built this little contraption here, and what we're going to do is we are going to set our rings on it. We have our oil control ring that goes at the bottom. The other two rings, two compression rings, are not labeled. So what I did was I just set the piston out. I laid each ring in the piston to see how they fit. And there is one that fits real nice in the top groove, and the other one is too big. So we know that the darker ring, the one here, goes in the middle, and this one goes on the top. So I like to put them that way on the little peggy hooks that I made. We're gonna do that for all three of them. And then what I'll do is I'll show you guys how I do this on one, then I'll just put the rest of them in so you don't have to watch me do the same thing over and over again. We don't want to have too high of cylinder pressure, meaning our gap is too small. We also don't want too big of a ring end gap. Then we're gonna get too much blow by and the car will burn oil. So really we need to find the balance of the two. The factory ring gap spec is 0.2 to 0.4 millimeters with, I think, a max wear limit of 0.8 millimeters, which is a huge ring end gap. I'm probably gonna set the ring gap about 0.4 millimeters. That's the high end of new spec, and that's sort of where I think, anyway, we should land with our upgrade pistons. Also, just so you know, these are measured at 81.5 millimeter pistons, right? That's how everything's labeled for these pistons. Also, don't come at me because I know this is not the exact right way to measure this. We should be using a micrometer, is the word. It's the second time today I forgot that. We should be using a micrometer to properly measure this, but what's worth noting is that when you measure one of these pistons, they don't actually measure 81.5 millimeters. So the number that they're giving you is not, at least in this case, could be different on other applications. It's not the size of the piston, it's the size of the bore, the hole where the piston goes, that number actually corresponds to. So it may not be anything like you really need to worry about, but I thought and found that interesting that they label it by bore size, and it says it right here on the box, not piston size, which piston size seems to be how the internet labels it. We have our piston. We have our 2 rings that we need to measure our piston ring end gap on. This is the ring that goes lower in the cylinder, so we can start with that. First thing I usually do though is I just make sure there's no like hard burrs or anything on it, so that when we slide that ring down, it doesn't score up or scratch up our cylinder wall. These feel pretty good. So we'll take our piston ring, squeeze it together a little, flip it down like that. Let's actually do it the other way. Now, unlike on most of the rest of these we've done, like the VR6s, we can take the piston, we can set it down, and that'll sort of flatten out the piston ring. So now we know it's nice and, I guess, centered, leveled. Leveled might be the right word. Give it a couple taps. Now we know it's even. Now we will take our feeler gauge set. Look at that. And we are looking for 0.406 is probably good. We're gonna err just a little on the big side. So I don't actually think we're gonna need to file that one at all. We'll do our top ring. Now I'm not gonna push the top ring quite as far down in the cylinder as I did the middle compression ring. And then we'll get our piston. You can see how it's not lined up right here. To line it up easy, we just take our piston. That'll pretty much guarantee you have it flat. We're gonna do our same measurements, start at 0.4. Okay, so yeah, I can't even get that one in. So we're gonna have to file a pretty good amount out of this top ring, which is not a big deal because we have left over from the blowed up Jetta project, a piston ring filer. Here we go with our ring gap or piston ring filer, I think is the technical name. What we need to do is we need to open this up. When it lived in the piston, it was like way crushed in. We need to open that gap up. The key to this though is one, you don't want to take too much out because you can't put it back. The other thing is you want to make sure that the ring end gaps are square is kind of the best way I can think of to describe it. If instead of being straight, it kind of favored going back to the back, that would be a bad thing. So we want to make sure we're filing it nice and straight. And as long as, even with this kind of crummy tool that I have, as long as you kind of hold it up against these 2 pins here, it's usually pretty okay. Basically what I'm getting at is don't get the cheapest ring file you can. And then we'll go ahead and do the other side. I like to take it evenly off of both sides. I don't know if that really matters or if that's just a habit that I have. Before I'm back with the ring, what I like to do is take a file and just kind of deburr the edges. You don't need to go crazy here, just to make sure that it's not razor sharp. We didn't really file a ton out. In fact, I think we're probably gonna have to go back a few more times. You just wanna make sure there's nothing super jagged. We will wipe our piston ring off to make sure there's no yuckity on there. Then we take it, we put it back in the bore, and we take our measurement again. Okay, back on our cylinder, we got our ring in, slide it into place, take our piston. I think we're gonna have to take a good amount more out of this thing. Oh yeah, we still gotta take a bunch out. So back to the file. I went ahead and did some more filing. Let's see how our little friend looks now. So you can see our gap there, quite a bit bigger than it was before. Let's test it. We're kind of chasing that 0.4 millimeters or 16 thousandths. We're pretty much right there. Let's always test the next one up too. If the feeler gauge you use fits, go up one and see what happens. Now we're going to take our ring out of our cylinder, and the one thing that I generally do next is I'll take the piston ring and I'll just run this little file stone just around the edges to make sure there's no sharp burrs or anything. Do that all around, mostly where we filed it. That's a really quick and simple step. We'll also go ahead and do it for the other compression ring as well. I don't generally do it on the oil control rings because usually you don't need to. There's good. Now what I'm also gonna do, because these kind of came to us pre-assembled, I'm just gonna take a look at my piston and connecting rod and make sure I don't have any sharp edges on it. Everything looks good. There is one of these rods that had a spot that was kind of boogered up. What I'll do once I have the bearing out is I'll just take this same little file stone and I'll just file it down. It's fine, that's not gonna impact anything. I just don't really like those jagged edges. You can see this is probably from where it was stored in that crazy boxes and boxes and boxes of parts. Next, we are going to pour some hot water and get some soapy water out of our hot water so that we can clean our piston rings. Now, you wanna make sure that you're doing this kind of quick, because if you leave these piston rings wet, they'll actually rust. This is all of them, including the oil control ring. We'll just rinse them around, oil or grease, get them all off of there. Learned this trick from a hot rod engine builder. Get them all clean. Then we'll go ahead and rinse them, and then use some compressed air to make sure that they're completely dry. Once our piston rings are clean, it's time to get our piston dialed in for installation. So we are going to undo our cap. Now these caps were torqued in order to measure our bearing clearance, so we might need to give these a little taparooski so they come apart. Now we can take our cap off. So these are new bearings that we got. I went ahead and got some performance bearings because this is generally a weak spot on 4 cylinders, and we're not trying to have any additional weak spots. We'll take our bearing out. We got to clean that mating surface. Now, I actually don't think I've shown this before. A little trick you can use is a coffee filter to clean these. They're lint-free, they're super cheap, and they work really, really well. Look at how much dirt was left behind. This is why it's important to clean stuff. Got some acetone here. We're going to clean it with this now. Now, because these have sat out for a while, I'm going to just give them a quick wipe down. They should be okay. Just wipe the back of our bearing quick. This stuff stinks, so we'll go ahead and get our bearing installed. We'll clean our cap. Same thing on the cap side. Clean our cap, install our bearing properly. And then these rods are numbered. You see the number right there. When you install them, you gotta make sure your numbers line up. We're not gonna put that on just yet, though. Next up, we gotta get our piston rings on. Now, this is an area where I have myself made mistakes and broke piston rings. I've also seen other people do it too. In fact, that's kind of how we got here. So I'm always like mega careful. We also wanna make sure on our bottom ring, which is our oil control ring, that we don't put any of the gaps over any of the oil holes. It's probably not really a problem since we have 3 gaps on that one ring. We also wanna make sure we offset the opening of our other 2 pieces of our oil control ring. So that accordion looking one goes first. Then it doesn't matter whether you do the top one or the bottom one next. I usually do the bottom one, then the top one. Then we are going to put our second compression ring on. Now in the Wiseco instructions, it talks about that tiny little shoulder on the edge facing down. This one, sometimes these are labeled and it'll say top on the piece that faces up or on the top ring. This one doesn't, but it does say N50. So we're gonna put that facing up. We'll get our pliers. Carefully spread those open and put that ring in. And we'll do the same thing for a top guy. Now where you put these on initially does not matter. It's where you have them clocked or oriented before you put it in the cylinder that's really all that matters. So it doesn't matter where we put these. These are easy to move around. So we want these all about 120 degrees off. So we'll put that one there. We'll do this one over here. And as you can see, this piston has a little recess in it for our intake valve. I usually try and not put the ring gaps there. Once we have our piston ready to go and we make sure our ring end gaps are appropriately clocked, we got to get our tool on. Now this isn't my favorite tool for compressing our piston rings, but I generally, what I do is I'll take one of these coffee filters, I'll wipe it out. There's just mostly oil in it, so not a big deal, but I will then oil it pretty much. Anything we can do to make this piston slide down in this cylinder easier, usually worth doing. I usually try to get this gap in this tool, where the flap is, away from the opening of the piston rings too. I do like to also make sure that there's no weird gaps here. We'll probably have to crunch this down a little bit more, but you also don't need to go to town on it. Then it makes a pain in the butt to drive the piston. So this is what we have. This is what it's gonna look like before it goes in the cylinder. This is pretty much the last time you're ever gonna see this beautiful connecting rod. Unless it decides to yeet itself out of the block, then we'll see it again soon. Now we did that basic cleaning of our cylinder bore when we took our piston ring measurements. I also went ahead and put 2, 3, and 4 pistons in because it was late at night. And sometimes I like to do these kind of things just for the pure enjoyment of doing them. But we need to get this cylinder clean so we can get our piston installed. Then what I usually do is take our little squirt guy and then squirt some oil in, just lube that cylinder up and get a little in the palm of your hand if that makes you happy. Then what I usually do is I'll grab the filter again, just make sure we're clean. We'll grab our piston. Now remember, we got that little notchy guy that has to face the intake side, which is this way, and make sure that is lined up. Then we'll just take the butt side, I guess probably more accurately the handle side of this hammer, and just give this piston a tap down until it settles into place. We'll run our crankshaft down all the way so our piston doesn't hit our crankshaft. They also make specialty hammers for this kind of thing, but I don't do this enough to buy a specialty hammer. Now, if you're tapping it down and you start to hear a difference in tone of where you're tapping, you might want to stop. what can happen is the piston ring can actually get out from where the compressor is. So this piston ring was actually hitting the block surface. So we need to reset and do it again. You really got to be paying attention here so that something like that doesn't happen, because that is how piston rings get broken. And once you have the piston rings past the edge of the block, you can give it a final tap. Once you have that piston somewhat down in the bore, we need to flip this baby over. And out of paranoia, I usually keep my hand over the piston, but honestly, the odds of it actually just coming out pretty low, so you probably don't need to do that. Now with our rod journal all the way up this way, but basically at the bottom of its travel, we have a little bit more room to mess around with our connecting rod here, get it set so that it doesn't whack our journal. I'm gonna get this pretty close up. Let's get a little bit of our engine lube. I'll just usually hold the connecting rod, tap it up. Now you can see our rod is up at the top. Here is our bearing cap, and we will do a better job of putting the lube on here. We also want to make sure our number on the cap corresponds to the proper side of the rod. Start our bolts by hand, then I just snug them up. We'll have to come back and torque everybody. You can run them in by hand. You just don't really want to use the bolt to pull the rod cap together. So what I'll do is I'll just get them a little snugged. Take that same old handle hammer handle I've been using. Just give it a little tap, and that, my friends, should properly seat it. Once you have your cap just a little bit snugged down, give your engine a twist, twisty twist, and make sure that you don't really feel any resistance. There'll be a little bit of drag from the piston rings pushing up against the cylinders, but it should turn pretty easily. If it doesn't turn pretty easily with just a basic size ratchet, then you really need to go back and double check and make sure maybe you put a cap on upside down or something else is not happy. Next up, we got to deal with our connecting rod bolts, and there's two main ways that people will properly torque these connecting rod bolts. One is going to be just hit a strike torque value. In this case, IE, who put the kit together for the rods and the caps and the bolts, says 50 pound-feet of torque. So easy, torque it to 50. They actually recommend loosening it and then torquing it again and then loosening it and torquing it again 3 times. 3 total torques to get everybody properly seated. So that's one way. The other way is to use something called the stretch gauge. As you tighten the bolt actually stretches. That's why we have certain bolts that need to be replaced from time to time, or one-time use bolts, probably more accurate way to say that. With these ARP bolts, you don't need to replace them when they stretch. They're meant to be reused multiple times. That's one of the advantages, right? So here is what a stretch gauge looks like, and here is our bolt. What we do is, with it in the engine, right, we take our gauge and we put the bolt in between these 2 points. This measurement here is the overall length of the bolt as it sits, not really the total length, because as you can see right here, there's a little bit of recess and a little bit of recess, which is why this bolt holds in place no problem. And what we would do is we would tighten this bolt until our bolt was a bit longer. So in this case, they're looking for 6 thousandths, which in my experience, it comes real close to what the recommended torque value is. Now, let's go ahead and get these bad boys properly torqued. Couple of things before we get started. One, we need to get some of that sweet, sweet lube on our threads and the heads of the bolts. You don't need to go crazy with it, but it does need to be properly lubricated. IE has some really good instructions on torquing these and installing these. You want to make sure you use a good torque wrench and it hasn't been dropped and all that stuff. They say 50 pound-feet is what you would torque it to, or 6 thousandths of stretch. You know, when companies take the time to put instructions on stuff like that, I find that oftentimes there's a reason. We're just gonna follow the instructions. Plus the guys at IE are really, really awesome. So that's about 5. So I think we're gonna be good there. I think torquing these to 50, no problem at all. After I torque each one down, I'm gonna rotate the engine around just to make sure we didn't do something wild and now have something hung up. I know some people hate paint marks. I like them. Moving right along, it's time to keep going on the bottom end. We need to get our oil pump put on next. These are the 3 bolts that go into the 3-bolt holes. An old school way of priming the oil pump would be to pack it full of Vaseline, and then that's what you used on first startup to make sure that you didn't cavitate the oil and get air and stuff in there. I'm not gonna do that, but what I am gonna do, put a little of our engine assembly paste on it. Then I'm just gonna rotate that around, try and get everybody nice and coated. That way we at least have some lubrication on that first startup. We'll get our new oil pump chain. Remember, this is a part that we didn't actually have in our We Have Everything setup. And we're just gonna hook it on the crankshaft and then set our oil pump in place. Then we'll take our oil return and windage tray and set that right on top. Then go ahead and put our bolts in, zip these down. Then these babies get torqued to 15 Newton meters, which is not very tight. We should probably go ahead and put our oil pump chain tensioner on here as well. And then I'm not gonna put the oil pan on next. I'm gonna leave that for like way down the road. The main reason is I wanna get the front crank seal and the rear main seal installed first. If you do it this way, you can just plop those covers right on and it's no big deal. If you have the pan on when you do that, you have to kind of rock the covers on, and it's just easier to do it this way. It might be a little bit of a pain in the butt to get the pan on with the engine on the stand, but we're gonna have to take the engine off the stand anyway to get the rear main seal on, so that's a problem we'll worry about later. So this tensioner is just a little spring tensioner. This pin right here has to go up against the block, and that like loads the spring tension, and I just hold the spring, and then that's really all the tension that the oil pump chain needs. That bolt is also 15 Newton meters, so we're already ready to go. So we need to get our front crank seal on because this is what's going to end up helping us get our crankshaft time so we can get our camshafts time. This sits on just like that. Now we have to make a choice with our seal. Do we want to put it on our cover first, or do we want to put our cover on and then try and moosh the seal on? Personally, I like to put the seal in the cover first and then install the cover. You can do these by hand, or you can take a little seal installer and tap them in, or even a hammer. The big thing is you want to make sure you install it evenly. Next up, we got to put a bead of silicone around the backside. Don't worry about the bottom right now. We'll do that when we do the oil pan. You can see where our cover was, the difference in texture between here and here. So that's kind of what we need to keep in mind. You don't need a ton. Remember, this like squishes out. Now, if we just go slamming our cover on, blah, we're going to end up destroying this seal right here. I have this little plastic cup from a seal from something else. I don't even remember what it's for. I think a BPY from the Jetta we blowed up. So I'm just gonna put it in there. And what we're gonna try and do is just gently stretch that seal out carefully. Zoom it right on like that. Then we can just go ahead and get them started. And our torque spec for these babies, 15 Newton meters. Next up, we have to put our timing gear on. That just sits on there like that. I'm going to install the old bolt. I have a new bolt, which this is a one-time use bolt, if you can imagine. I just don't have the tool yet. It's lost in the mail. Now, this is actually another spot where it's probably not a bad idea to upgrade from this cast gear to a billet gear that's a bit stronger. You can also get them with 6 holes instead of 4, but I think for our application, this is going to be just fine. Let's go ahead and get our block surface ready to put our head gasket on. Now, this is also the last time, hopefully anyway, we're gonna see our open cylinders, so make sure there's no dirt or anything in them, and if they're looking dry, go ahead and give them a wipe out. Wipe out and wipe down. Make sure we don't have any yuck left in there. Then we'll go ahead and clean our gasket surface. We do want this surface to be clean and dry. Now we can go ahead and put our head gasket on. This has still got the plastic on it, but we'll take that off in just a second. This is how the head gasket fits on there. You need to make sure that you have not only your head bolts lined up, but all the passages and galleys lined up as well. Since we overbored our cylinders, we need to pay attention to the bore of the head gasket. Now, luckily for us, we only did 0.5 millimeter, so this won't be an issue for us. So if I set this on here, you can see we don't have any issues. It's barely opened up bigger than it was from the factory with just 0.5 millimeter overbore. Now for our cylinder head, look at that freshy surface. Use that same cleaning method that we did for the block. Then we can carefully set this on. Now there are alignment dowels here and here. Luckily this one's not super heavy. Also I have the cams out still. That's gonna make it a little easier to put this together, I think. All right. That was much less satisfying than I had anticipated. Like many VW Audi engines, the head bolts are one-time use, and these are kind of unique. You notice that it's threaded down here at the bottom, but it's also threaded with a little bit bigger thread up here at the top. So this threads into the cylinder head, and then this part here threads into the block. So we'll go ahead and drop those babies down in. Now we can go ahead and get the rest of these guys in here. You want to pay attention to the repair manual. Some manufacturers say you need to lubricate these bolts. Some say clean and dry. Some don't say anything. Typically, if it doesn't say anything, it's clean and dry. I do like to clean these, just soapy water, dry them off, and that usually gets it done. These are that poly drive that so many VW Audi head bolts are. We'll go ahead and just get these snugged. I'm only snugging these down the equivalent of roughly hand tight. Let's go ahead and get this thing torqued down. We are going to start at 40 Newton meters. Then we're going to do a quarter turn and then another quarter turn to equal a half a turn. And remember, these kind of bolts usually have a sequence to them, usually starting in the middle and working your way out. We're going to start with our quarter turn. We're also going to get a bigger ratchet so that it's a little easier to quarter turn. Now we got to go back and do that exact same thing, pretty much in that exact same order. I usually try and go parallel to something to start my 90 so that I'm perpendicular to it when I finish. You could also use the torque angle wrench. Okay, we are good. Next up, we got to load up all of our lifters into our cylinder head, which are these guys here. We're just going to give them a little bit of cleanup. Then take some of our assembly grease, little boop on the bottom, little boop on the top. I like to always put these back where they came from if I'm not replacing them. That way, any slightly weird pattern of wear or anything like that, you'll at least have the same kind of thing in the same cylinder. You won't cause more damage. Probably, honestly, completely unnecessary, but it's another one of those habits that I'm just in. And our last intake one, yay. And pretty much same thing for the exhaust. Now the way these work, look, if you look, you can see there's a tiny little hole right there. Oil comes in, this hole right here corresponds with that hole right there in the head. You can see there's like a channel right through here, and that's what supplies oil to these guys. Final one, and then we'll just dab a little dab. This is going to lubricate the camshaft mostly on that first startup before we get all the oil up to the top end. These are like alignment dowels, I guess is the best way to describe it, for our cam caps and our cam chain tensioner. These go kind of like that. I wonder what an easy way to install these would be. Let's give these guys just a nice and fresh. Make sure our sealed surfaces are nice and clean. I've already lubricated everybody. Now let's get our cams set in. I already got the chain on the cam. And since we already did all the timing, I was able to mark our new chain, so this should go pretty easily. That's mostly lined up. Try and get the cams as close to TDC cylinder 1 as possible, which means that these lobes here for cylinder 1 both point inward. Now, before we get too carried away with our cam adjuster, we need to get some new feet put on it. These aren't too bad. I've definitely seen worse, but look at how dark they are. And we definitely don't want to put this back together on a freshly built engine. So we'll go ahead and get this apart. Then these just pop off. And the new ones are usually a little harder to get on. So that kind of goes in like that. So there we go. There's our top one. Put that back on, and we'll do the same thing on our bottom one. Nice and on there. Now that we got our new feet in, the next thing we need to do is we need to press this tensioner in order to get our tool installed so that it'll hold it all together. A number of different ways to do this. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take a couple zip ties. It's not super hard to compress that spring. So if you had someone to like hold it for you, or you could even put it in a vise, that would be ideal. Now you don't need to compress it all the way. You only need it enough to get the tool started. So once you can get the tool started, I actually think that's enough. Get off. There, get that out of the way. Slowly compress this. Next up, we need to get our cam adjuster gasket, which is actually two gaskets, the little half moony guy and the metal guy. Now here on the back side of our cylinder head is where our cam adjuster goes. This is our coolant flange. We have our little half moony guy, and I like to put a little bit, not a lot of it, a little bit of silicone, just enough to fill the gaps, kind of like that. Gets set right down in there. It'll squish down when we tighten our cam adjuster. So if we get our chain tensioner in here, you might have to pull this up. So our chain tensioner kind of lives in here like that. With our tensioner on, now we got to put our cam caps in. I'm going to make sure our seals are tucked where they need to be. Now, I'm probably going to replace these seals. The problem is holding the camshaft to get the gear off is usually pretty tricky. So we'll get everything mounted up. Then I think I'll pop the gear off and replace the seal. I will go ahead and clean off the caps that we're putting on where I don't need it lubricated. I already put some lubricant on there. Man, that stuff, I like how that stuff went on. That was nice. Then we'll go ahead and just drop our caps on. 5, 4, 3, 2, and then the back one. Same thing for the other one. Now, these are something that you do want to make sure you torque down properly, as well as follow the sequence so that you are evenly tightening these all down. The other critical step before you tighten all this stuff down for the camshafts, you need to make sure you roll the crankshaft back a couple of teeth. You don't need to go crazy with it, like half revolution or anything like that, but you do want to back it up a little bit. Since this is an interference engine, if your cams aren't timed properly and you tighten them down, it'll push open one of the valves and can actually bend a valve or doink a piston or something like that. So we don't want to do that. We just want to back the crankshaft back just a little bit. Mine's, I don't know, 2 teeth back, so we're good there. Now, I'm going to start all the bolts and run them in just a little bit. What I'm not going to do is send them home and tighten them down. There's a certain order that we want to make sure we follow. Now, these caps are labeled 5, 4, 3, 2, this one's not labeled, and 5, 4, 3, 2, this one's not labeled. We're going to start by tightening 2 and 4 first, and we're going to tighten 2 a little, tighten 4 a little, tighten 2 a little, tighten 4 a little, tighten 2 a little, tighten 4 a little. You can see as I tighten this down, it'll slowly move the camshaft into place. What it's actually doing is pushing probably cylinder 3 valve open for the intake. We'll go ahead and do the same thing for the exhaust cam. And usually for the final little bit, I'll just go by hand so I can have a little bit better feel on it. Sometimes that feel is lost with the little impact gun there. Now, we're going to torque those guys down to 10 Newton meters. I'm just going to check this other one on 4 as well. I got them pretty close with just the hand tool there. I'll probably, at the end of this, go back and just double check them all. The next ones we need to tighten down are the 2 at the back where the chain is. We'll go ahead and snug those guys down, torque those to 10 Newton meters as well. After torquing these down, that'll allow us to check our timing on the top side of the engine and make sure that we're all timed up. Now we're pretty close to the timing marks here on the back side of the chain. Now what I can do is I can finish tightening down the rest of our cam caps that aren't tight, except this one at the front. I'm going to leave this one loose because we're going to take it off when we put our cam seals on. We'll go ahead and torque these all down. All these are 10 Newton. Let me know in the comments, what do you guys prefer, the buzz of the torque wrench, or do you like that satisfying click? I don't know. I like them both. They're both satisfying for me. All right. That's pretty good. I'm pleased. I am pleased with that. Okay, before we get crazy with our timing belt, let's go ahead and get these cam seals done. I'm gonna do the intake cam first. Then all this stuff should just come right out nice and easy. This little ring here is for the cam sensor. You can see it only goes on one way. Now you remember I said I wasn't gonna tighten that last cam cap, which is this one here. The reason this is gonna make doing this job a million times easier. In fact, just go ahead and take it all the way out. I mean, honestly, this seal probably was fine, but since we have a new one, we'll go ahead and slide it on. Now, if you've never replaced a cam seal, something you can do to open this up a little bit is take a socket and just kind of stretch it carefully. You see it kind of spread the seal a little bit there. Now, this one was super easy because we had the cap off, so you really didn't even need to do that, but that makes it easier. We'll go ahead and put our ring back in because you can put a little blue thread locker on our bolt, and I don't think that's going to be enough to rotate our engine around at all. 25 Newton meters. Next up, we got to do the cam gear, which generally is a little trickier than doing this one. You can zip this off with an impact in most cases. If you don't have an impact that'll knock that off, you're going to have to hold the gear and break the bolt loose using a cam bar like this. Odds are this bolt is probably a one-time use guy. We'll go ahead and pop that off, clean this out. Same thing we did for the other one. We'll slide this little guy on here. We can actually put that guy on. Go ahead and snug this cap down. And since we're here, let's go ahead and torque that back to 10 Newton meters. Go ahead and get our gear put back on. Now, I have heard tale of people putting these on backwards. Maybe it's not this engine because that didn't really fit. Make sure that you put the gear back on the right way. Otherwise, you're gonna have a bad time. Just like we did for the intake cam, I'm gonna put a little thread locker on this guy. Now in the repair manual, it actually doesn't call for that to be replaced. Now it may call for it somewhere else in the repair manual, but not in the like breakout. So we're gonna torque this thing to 65 Newton meters and call it good. Before we get too carried away with our timing, we got to get our water pump on, because our water pump on this engine is driven by our timing belt. And we already cleaned the orifice for our water pump. Before I put this pump in, I always like to use a little bit of dielectric and lubricate this seal. We'll go ahead and lubricate this well here as well. We'll go ahead and slide our pump in just like that, 3 10mm. Now they do make a metal impeller water pump for these older engines, the 1.8s and the 2-liter non-turbos. I found that the OE ones, especially like the newer revisions, work pretty well and don't have that super come apart problem that they used to, 15 years ago. And we will torque these to 15 Newton meters. Okay, now we can move on to our timing belt, which is pretty straightforward. We have a hydraulic tensioner that goes right here. Next, we have to put our roller on. Now this roller should have a washer on the back side of it. Mine didn't, but somehow miraculously in my pile of nonsensical things, I found one that I think is actually from 1.8 turbo tensioner. We'll go ahead and get this guy on. Go ahead and just snug that down a little bit. We don't want to tighten it just yet. Before we get too carried away, we need to slide down to our crankshaft. We need to tighten this bolt down. We never tighten this, we just kind of set it in place. For our bolt replacement here, we actually need to hold this gear. This is a big boy torque spec of 90 Newton meters plus an additional 90 degrees. And for that, we need this guy, this Long John Silver's guy right here. What this does is this bolts to our gear so that we can counter hold it. We'll go ahead and get that mounted up. You could probably do this, since we're really only replacing the bolt, you probably do this with the belt on. Counter hold, get our old bolt off. All right, 10 minutes of looking. I found our new bolt here. This might have been a new bolt when we got this project, but I'm on a better safe than sorry with this kind of thing. If this bolt comes loose, we're gonna have a bad day. This should be a satisfying click. That wasn't nearly as satisfying as I was hoping for. Then we can mark right at 12, and we'll do our 90 degrees. Yeah, 90. Even the camera felt that. Now we can go ahead and get our tool off of here and keep on going. While we're down here, go ahead and slide our crankshaft to TDC. Well, now we can keep grooving on our timing belt. We'll pull this roller off, which makes it easier. Drop our valve cover on to make sure our cam's at TDC. We're 1 tooth off on the top. There we go. Pop our belt on. All right, there is our belt. We'll go ahead and torque our roller down, and then we'll pull our pin, rotate our engine around twice on the crankshaft side to do 1 full revolution of the camshaft. Lined up, lined up. Go ahead and tighten down our roller to 25 Newton meters. And boy, oh boy, we are on our way. Now that our belt's on, we can start to put our covers on. That's always a good day. I also got to find the cover that goes above it, because I have no idea where it is. What's fun is, because I had to get that other block, I actually have 2 of the cover that goes right above it. One of them is real boogered up. The other one's a little better, so I think we're gonna use that one. Because of the way our engine is mounted on the engine stand, we're not gonna be able to do the rear main seal or the clutch or anything like that with the engine on the stand. So what I have is this really awesome Eurowise mount that mounts right here to the engine. Instead of the engine being the way it is now, this will go in the tube, so our engine will basically be 90 degrees different. Ta-da! Now probably what's going to be the worst part of this whole job is we got to take this off of that side and put it on this side. Now that we have our engine mounted up so we can access the back of it, we're going to start by cleaning this surface so we can get our rear main seal on. This rear main seal actually has the gasket kind of attached to it already, so we don't really have to worry about that. We do have to be careful of the seal itself, make sure that goes on the crankshaft properly. It's important to note the way this seal goes on, the lip actually has to go backwards, so it's a little weird. You got to be extra careful. You can take this guy off. 6 bolts, 15 Newton meters apiece. No sealant needed because it had that little rubber gasket on it. And we'll go ahead and mark these. Now we can go ahead and put our clutch on. This is a stage 3 clutch with a light flywheel. The flywheel weighs about 19 pounds. Then our holes are offset, so you got to make sure you line them up properly. The factory flywheel has timing marks on it. I'm pretty sure this has a dual mass from the factory. Luckily, our kit came with all new hardware and everything too, because I don't think we had any of it. Go ahead and get all of our flywheel bolts started. We'll get this torqued down, and then after I get it all torqued down, I'll go ahead and clean this flywheel surface. Also, flywheel bolts, as you may have guessed, are one-time use, and they come pre-micro encapsulated, which just means it has thread locker on it. Now we'll go ahead and resurrect our bent valve here so that we can hold our flywheel from turning. So we're going to torque this in 3 stages. We're going to go 30, which I kind of already hit on some of them apparently. So then we're going to go up to 60 Newton meters. Now we have to do an additional 90. So we'll go ahead and make our marks at 12 o'clock. Going back and checking the torque is easy. Seeing if you did it a quarter turn is not easy. You guys already know what I did. Shouldn't have forgotten. I forgot the cover. So this is a shield that actually is supposed to go behind the flywheel. I looked at it and I was like, I need to put this on. Then I put the rear main on. I was like, I need to put this on. Well, crisis and conundrum averted. I actually had another set of flywheel bolts. It took some digging, but I got 6 brand new bolts. Now, that's not to say that if you had ran into this same issue, you need to actually take the flywheel off. But I think if I were to use this shield, I would probably cut it right about here. There's a bolt that goes here and a bolt that goes here, and that would hold this in place. For our case, I'm gonna take the flywheel back off and do it again. You better believe that I'm grumping myself this whole damn time. The other option would be to take the bolts out and re-Loctite them. Odds are that probably would be okay too, but you know, is it worth it? I don't know, probably not. Probably worth just taking them back off and doing it right. I don't even really remember why I have an extra set of these. I know I had a set for a while, and this might actually be left over from the Jetta series. Now the internet will know I did it the right way. So you guys have already seen this. Let's skip to putting the clutch on. Now that that unpleasantness is behind us, let's go ahead and clean our flywheel. Look how dirty that is. That's mostly the oil they put on there so that it doesn't rust. But that's pretty clean. Let's go ahead and get our clutch on. Now it's important to pay attention to which way the friction disc goes for our clutch. In our case, this hub piece right here where the springs are goes towards the engine like that. We'll get our alignment tool to hold it in place. That holds just like that. Just like we did to our flywheel, we're gonna clean our pressure plate. Same thing, coat it in oil so that it doesn't rust. We have 3 dowels to line up. So that aligns just like that. And then we'll go ahead and start our bolts. Think of tightening flywheel bolts like torquing a wheel down. You want to go in that star pattern, and these you want to tighten down a little bit of it at a time, so you're kind of walking the pressure plate on. I think I just called them flywheel bolts. I meant bolts for our pressure plate that go into the flywheel. That's what I meant said. While you're snugging your pressure plate down, make sure that your clutch alignment tool is perfectly centered. It should be pretty well centered just by using the tool. If there's any question, hold it center. Then we're going to torque these babies to 20 Newton meters. I'm going to start by torquing everybody to 10, then we'll go back around and do our 20. Probably overkill, to be honest. All right, there's our 10, and we'll go back around to 20. And we are done. Boop. Next up, let's get back to the top side and get our cylinder head cover, also known as valve cover, on. Now, for some reason, they took the studs out of the cylinder head. You'll notice we have 2 different sizes with 2 different lengths of unthreaded bits. The longer ones go in the middle, where the ignition coils go. The shorter ones mostly go across the front. This is the front of our engine. One in the back at the middle. You're looking at the backside right here. This is where our exhaust manifold will bolt on. But there's also an unequal, I guess, number of the longer ones. So our longer ones go across the middle, where our spark plugs go. At the back side, on the exhaust side, the 2 extra longer ones that we have, and I think that leaves enough thread sticking up for, say, accessories to bolt on and stuff like that. And we can just snug these down hand tight. We don't need to go crazy with these things. We can go ahead and get our spark plug well gasket on. Then for our valve cover gasket itself, there's a couple of spots where we want to use a little RTV in the corners where the gasket changes direction. So like where the cam variator is and then our front cam caps. Then what I always like to do with the little half moon shape here, put a bit of sealant in that. You don't need a lot. Put your gasket on. You want to make sure the gasket's all the way seated. Next, we got to put our little guards on here over our intake cam. We'll go ahead and put some sealant in the corners of the gasket. Go ahead and set our valve cover on like that and go find some nuts. Like many of our fasteners in this capacity, the torque spec for these is 10 Newton meters. It's been a while since I put a torque wrench on a valve cover for a 1.8 turbo. Next, we're gonna flip this engine over, work on the bottom side. Now we can close up our bottom end. We also need to put our pickup tube on. Always make sure you put that seal on there. Not a bad idea to lubricate both the pickup and the seal. Now we've already pretty much got our block cleaned up. We got our pan cleaned up. We need to get our sealant on our pan. We'll go ahead and watch down here at the bottom. This is so much easier when it's not in the car. And we'll get a couple screws started. And if you're still keeping track of torque specs, 15 Newton meters for your oil pan. Like so many other fasteners, I like to work around so that you don't just do like all one side and run the risk of something getting not right. Probably pretty low risk for this one, but moving on, let's work on the front side of our engine. Now, my next step was actually gonna be to put this cross pipe that goes, well, across here. Unfortunately, I don't have an O-ring for that. The oil cooler. I couldn't find an oil cooler. The oil cooler mounts right here to this piece. Not a huge deal. We'll make sure we get this guy installed. This only goes one way. Fits on the back side of our oil filter housing here. I don't know that I've ever actually replaced one of these on a 1.8. Now, unfortunately, we're not gonna be able to put our PCV stuff on until I get this coolant pipe in. Otherwise, that's gonna be a nightmare. Now, initially, I did have a new thermostat housing to install, but I did decide to upgrade to the metal ones from Eurowise, so I bought the whole kit. Anytime you take one of these thermostats out on a high mile car, it's better to just go ahead and put a new one on, then don't have to worry about it. I went ahead and opened up that bag of parts that I assume anyway were the turbo kit. What I'm seeing here feels almost exactly like what the Mark III VR6 turbo setup felt like. What I'm gonna do first is install some studs in our manifold. This is where our turbocharger is gonna bolt to. Here we have our 2-nut method, and that's what we're gonna use to install the stud. Also important to pay attention to, you can see the lengths are different. This is shorter, this is longer. The shorter threads go into the manifold. Do that for all 4 of these. And just so we have a couple of things less to be responsible for, go ahead and put our gasket and the nuts that are gonna go on here. Not sure where these go yet, but I should hopefully have enough anyway, nuts to replace all the exhaust manifold nuts. And I have a gasket. Now what I thought would be fun was to test fit the original turbocharger, this one, onto the engine to show you what it looks like. Itty bitty teeny weeny exhaust manifold and the bolts that I scrounged together to make this fit. Go ahead and put our gasket on so I don't forget that. Here's our manifold. We'll get our turbocharger test fit in just a minute. Also from the factory, this car has these washers on the studs, so I cleaned these up. Miraculously, I found all of them. What I am gonna do is tighten this down in a second here. Right here, this is why mechanics have good dexterity in their hands and why their hands hurt all the time. Well, that was fun. I guess now there's nothing to do but to take these nuts off and put on our turbocharger. Ta-da! Now, I'm instantly wondering, is this where our oil drain is actually gonna be, or are we gonna have to clock this differently? Not really sure, but what I am really sure of is we're just gonna go ahead and loosely bolting this turbo on. I think we're just gonna have to leave it like this for now. Okay, I'm leaving you with the engine mounted up and installed in the car. I still have a ton more work to do figuring out charge cooler piping and all the hose routing. This is the problem you run into when you buy a car that's been completely taken apart and sat for 3 years. More on that when we're deeper into this 1.8 turbo TT project. Questions or comments, as always, drop them down below. I will put links to everything we use down in the description. With that, I'm out. Have an awesome day.
And I'll talk to you again next time.